Hey everyone, this is Hugh from Plaguelands Media, and today we are not looking at a particular book, we're not looking at a particular author, we are looking at a particular character. The idea for today's episode actually stems from a conversation I had with my good friend Luke Carmen. You might remember him from, I don't know, the last fucking episode. A few years ago, my wife and I were back in Australia visiting my father. And as we always used to do, Luke would come up for a barbecue party, and he and I were in the backyard drinking and chatting away. And at the time, he was teaching writing classes at Western Sydney University. And he was telling me that he asks his students a very important question. And I think this is a question that all writing teachers should ask their students. Why do you want to write? It was around the time that Game of Thrones was becoming really big on HBO, and so a lot of people were actually going back and reading the books. And I believe The Last Kingdom had just come out on Netflix based on the series of books by Bernard Cornwell. And so a lot of his students were talking about writing that next big fantasy epic, the next great fantasy series. There are a lot of great fantasy series out there. There's the Stormlight Archives by Brandon Sanderson, the Lightbringer series by Brent Weeks. A lot of people believe the Wheel of Time series is one of the best fantasy series ever written. I personally disagree, but I will be talking about Robert Jordan later on in this video. So his students were talking about this new wave of fantasy, which really is an old wave of fantasy. And it made me a little bit angry that people are losing sight of where genres come from, where the fantasy genre came from, even the horror genre. There's people out there that are reading the new Stephen King novels, but not reading his early works. And they're really missing out on seeing the evolution of the author. And in the case of today's episode, the evolution of a character, because I want to focus today on probably one of the most famous fantasy characters ever, next to R.A. Salvatore's Drizzt Do'Urden. I apologize if I didn't pronounce that correctly. And that's Conan the Barbarian, otherwise known as King Conan of Aquilonia, otherwise known as Conan the Cimmerian. So let's get right to it with a new episode of I'm not going to go into the whole history of the character of Conan the Barbarian. We all know that he was created by Robert E. Howard, first appeared in the short story The Phoenix on the Sword in the December 1932 issue of Weird Tales. What I want to talk about is the evolution of the character and the fact that this evolution didn't come from the original author. Now, there are a lot of Conan stories out there. You have to remember when you're reading the early Conan works that the character himself is a very one-dimensional character. Robert E. Howard was essentially inventing the genre of sword and sorcery. And so you have this character who is raised in Cimmeria. He's a barbarian. He travels the world. He constantly getting into fights, constantly getting into trouble. He's fighting sorcerers. He's rescuing damsels in distress. All of the formulaic, generic stuff you would expect from a fantasy story. Each Conan story, if you read them, they follow a very similar pattern. The character might change a little bit from story to story, but ultimately, these stories are very formulaic. There are a lot of great books out there that have all of the Conan stories in them. The one that I prefer is the Broadsword Legacy Collection, because this has the Conan stories not in the year of publication, but in the kind of the Conan timeline. So you're reading them in the order of Conan as he kind of grows as a character. It's a very good collection, but like I said, there are a lot of collections out there. Now, the problem with early Robert E. Howard Conan stories, as I said, is that the character is somewhat one-dimensional and somewhat an amalgamation of other characters that Robert E. Howard created. King Kull of Atlantis. To a lesser extent, you can see a little bit of Solomon Kane in Conan, although I believe Solomon Kane, my opinion again, is a much more well-rounded character, and the stories are incredibly exciting and entertaining. Check out Solomon Kane as well if you want some great short stories. But that isn't the Conan that a lot of people know. A lot of people know Conan from, of course, the fantastic films Conan the Barbarian and Conan the Destroyer, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. There was Conan the Barbarian starring Jason Momoa, which a lot of people shit on. And hey, you're well within your rights to do that, but I really enjoyed that film, especially the opening sequence where a young Conan is in the foot race and he has to keep the bird egg in his mouth, and he comes back with the heads of all the pigs and spits the egg out on the ground. I think that's just an amazing scene. But you've got to understand that while a lot of people have kind of played with the character of Conan, most of the books that were published up until about the 1980s were just reprints of the Robert E. Howard stories. And it wasn't until 1982 that the publishing company Tor actually started with a new line of Conan novels. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Robert Jordan, who wrote the Wheel of Time series. Robert Jordan kicked off the Tor series of Conan stories with 7 standalone novels. Yes, 7. Robert Jordan brought back Conan into mainstream fantasy literature, but he's remembered for Wheel of Time. And to me, that's really sad, because I've been reading his Conan novels and they are absolutely fantastic. They create a new world for Conan to play in. Still the Hyperborean age, of course, but there are new characters that he interacts with, new monsters, new creatures. The first of the stories is basically set against a backdrop of a wizard's castle, complete with serpent men, which we all know are from the Cthulhu mythos. So you're throwing in a little bit of H.P. Lovecraft there. But then the second novel shifts and puts Conan in a city where he has to kind of get this mercenary band together. And in order to kind of get money, he decides to show the king of this city that he can bring new skills to the army. And so he shows off some skills that he learned from the warriors of Katai, which is the Hyperborean age's kind of oriental area or Asian area. I apologize if that was racially insensitive. And these novels go along, and Conan the Destroyer, the novelization of the film, was actually one of these Robert Jordan novels, of these 7 Robert Jordan novels. But they don't stop there. There were 43 Conan novels published by Tor under different authors up until the year 2003. 43 books expanding on the history and mythology of a character, so that I am sure when we get to the modern, I believe it was 2011 Conan film, you're getting influences from all of these different kind of authors, all of these different book series. But we can't just stop talking about the character of Conan and novels, because we have to remember comic books as well. Marvel with the Savage Sword of Conan, with the Conan the Barbarian titles from the 70s going all the way through to the 90s. You even have Conan appearing in Red Sonja, another fantastic character, another fantastic film as well. The Conan comics aren't dead. They've been going on and on and on up until the latest series, Conan the Barbarian. Marvel got the rights back. The Life and Death of Conan, Book 1 and Book 2. If you want to read modern Conan, read these. These are absolutely phenomenal. There are 12 issues in these two books, and they tell the completed kind of story. It is Conan as a king, Conan as a father, but all told in backstories against a common enemy, and the threads are kind of woven through. Really fantastic read. So what I am ultimately saying is we have the character of Conan, initially a one-dimensional character, but other authors have built upon this character, have created stories and history and mannerisms where we cannot look at Conan now as simply a one-dimensional barbarian character. If we look at Conan now, we're seeing a fully fleshed out, well-rounded character with flaws, with mannerisms, and sure, it's far-fetched. I understand that. He's this burly, gruff barbarian, which is a stereotype. He's chivalrous, he's honorable, he has a code of ethics. All of these things are designed to get us to love the character, and that's just great. That's fine. I love the character of Conan. I'm sure a lot of you watching this video love the character of Conan as well. What I'm ultimately saying is, if you have a character that you love, if you have a genre of books that you love to read, or comics that you love to read, or movies that you love to watch, don't stop there. Go back. Look at where these things came from. Understand the history of them. And ultimately, what is going to happen is your enjoyment of that character, of that genre of book, of that author, of that director, of that screenwriter, whatever. Your enjoyment of their work is going to just intensify. So please don't forget the history of what you're reading, the history of what you're watching, the history of what you're even doing. If it's something like video games or board games or role-playing games, look at what came before, and it's going to increase your enjoyment of what comes after. You might consider all this a load of shit, and you're perfectly within your right to do that. That is fine. Again, this is just my opinion. So I urge everyone out there to please go and read a fucking book, people.